If you've moved into a new home and have started to suspect it might be haunted, here are some tips for living in a haunted house. Do you have a tingling feeling up on the back of your neck in certain locations of your house? Do you hear strange noises such as footsteps around the house where no one is at? Maybe your lights flicker when there should be no reason for them to. Most hauntings can be explained by strange lighting or badly set windows, but sometimes a haunting isn't just a noisy raccoon or a loose light switch. Some people suggest addressing a spirit. On this channel, we suggest ignoring the spirit. Intention is important. But what if you're a kid, like Jessie, when he lived in a haunted house? This is a true story, though names and details have been changed. A traumatic paranormal experience in Baltimore. When Jessie was 14 years old, he lived in Baltimore, Maryland. Many scary things happened in the house. This was the worst. Jessie was having a sleepover with his best friend, Derrick, and his brother, Kenny. They had 2 window air conditioning units, because growing up in Baltimore, it could get really hot in the summer, and there weren't many central air conditioning units. Jessie's mom and stepdad had their own air conditioning unit in their bedroom. The other air conditioner was in the living room, which was why the 3 boys would camp out there. The living room was small and dark, with sheets draped everywhere to keep the cool air inside. The boys were lounging on the couch, drinking lemonade and trying to stay cool. Jessie told the story and said, "All 3 of us were talking about girls. You know how high school boys are." There was a blanket covering the doorway to keep the air in the living room. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a baby crawling right through that blanket. We couldn't believe our eyes. A baby crawled right through the blanket. There was no baby in the house, and none of my neighbors had kids that young. But the weird thing was, the blanket never moved. The baby went through it, not under it or over it, but right through it, like the blanket wasn't even there. At first, we didn't even register that fact, or the fact that even though the baby was crying, it didn't make a sound. About 5 seconds later, a man came rushing through the blanket, making no sound. The blanket didn't move, and even though the man was screaming, we didn't hear a thing. The man stood over the baby and screamed, quickly picked up the child, and walked right back through the sheet, like the fabric wasn't even there. All of us started screaming. Jessie had been horrified when he told the story, even though neither the man or the baby had made any sound at all. And even though they saw the man vanish through the sheet covering the doorway, the boys frantically searched everywhere for the man and child. Jessie's friend looked at him and said, "Did you see that man? The baby?" Derrick, Jessie's brother, said yes. They were horrified after having a traumatic paranormal experience. They kept frantically checking the hallway where the man had walked and the doorway at the end of the hall. The door was locked, and it was really loud when it opened. They would have heard the man go through the door. And of all the crazy things that happened in that house, this was absolutely the most traumatizing. All 3 of them made a pact not to say anything to their mother or sister about what they saw, because Jessie's sister at that time just lost a baby to SIDS and did not want to upset her. Soon, Jessie had buried the memory so deep, he almost thought he'd made it up. It wasn't until 20 years later that everything changed. About 20 years later, Jessie's mom was visiting, and they were talking about the house on Lombard Street. She asked Jessie if he remembered the house. He said, "How could I forget that house? It was haunted." After a long pause, she looked at her son with tears in her eyes. She then quietly asked him, "Did you ever see a man chasing a baby?" Jessie was shocked. He said, "Did Kenny or Derrick tell you?" She said they'd never mentioned anything about it. Then she told Jessie a story about a frantically crawling baby, crying without a sound, and a screaming man who took the baby and just disappeared. The same exact story. It had horrified her for years, but she'd never mentioned it to her sons because she didn't want to traumatize them. They both hugged, and Jessie felt like a weight was lifted off his shoulders. It felt good just to talk with someone who understood. Jessie says, "I will never forget what I saw, and I hope to never see anything like that again." A lot of other things happened. Tips for living in a haunted house. If you think there's a ghost in your house, there are going to be skeptics, quite possibly yourself. So the more evidence you can pull together to convince either your family and friends or yourself that you haven't lost your mind, the better. Documenting instances of unexplained activity through a journal or video will also help if you plan on consulting paranormal professionals, also known as ghost hunters, for advice. According to Jessie, that wasn't the only paranormal experience that happened at his home in Baltimore. For instance, his sister was laying next to her boyfriend, and she went to put her arm around him and felt silky fabric, and she looked up and saw a strange woman lying between her and her boyfriend. Jessie says, "One night I was laying in bed next to my brother, and my brother was sleeping. I was laying on my back and I saw a string of hair falling from the ceiling. And as soon as the hair hit the bed, I heard a little girl giggling. I looked over toward the stairs and saw a little girl standing there, and then she vanished." One time, Jessie says, "I was walking up the steps and my older brother and sister saw a man walking behind me, going up the steps wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. When I turned around, he was gone. My sister's boyfriend was playing Ouija with my sister and a couple of friends, and he asked what year he was going to die. And the Ouija board said 1997. It was 1993, and he died in 1997. You could hear people walking when no one else was home. When my dad died," says Jessie, "every picture in the house went crooked simultaneously. I remember my sister and her boyfriend standing next to the kitchen sink. The dish strainer was full of dishes. The strainer lifted off the kitchen counter by itself and flipped over. My mom's friend kept seeing a man walking in the same direction over and over. My older brother's friend stayed over one night and saw an old man smoking a cigarette on the edge of the bed. He actually smelled the smoke. We thought we heard a girl scream that night, but it was actually him. He didn't believe the house was haunted and thought everyone was BSing, but he found out the hard way. We had a member of the church come over and bless the house when we first moved in. The person said they weren't going to come in past the doorway because they felt uncomfortable. We lived there for 5 years. The house was condemned by the state. It's no longer standing. Jessie says, I'm so happy it's gone. 9 times out of 10, there'd be a logical explanation to unusual things that happen in a home. Steps might mean pests or a gopher. Dripping water just be a problem with the plumbing. Lights flickering, well, call an electrician. But if this isn't what the problem is, find the courage. Ghosts thrive on fear. The more afraid a person is, the bolder a spirit will get. Summon up your courage and show the ghost you're not afraid or unwelcomed. Maybe get a pet, a dog or a cat, even a hamster. Animals can sense the presence of a spirit. If not, get a pet anyway, because they're great. Sometimes a ghost might just be trying to communicate. Just listen. If the spirit seems malicious or aggressively, there are options. Intent is important. Sage leaves, a cross, a crystal, whatever is sacred to you. Either help put the spirit at rest or your mind at ease.